So here we are on Friday afternoon again, and here are my comments on past week. This coming week, some interesting materials. We're coming up to talk about Hanukkah, as Hanukkah itself is coming up soon. And you will see that I included a kind of separate lesson that I had done for a different course about the history of Hanukkah. We're not really quite up to that material in the chronology of the course, but I thought it might be interesting for you to see it, and it goes back to the Talmud and so on. But Hanukkah is a fascinating holiday, and I've always had a kind of ongoing interest in it, along with the whole question of the Hasmonean rebellion. And then later on, you're going to read material by Shaya Cohen on what is a Jew, who is a Jew. Everybody gets asked that question: what is Jewishness? Where does it come from? How does it start? And so forth. And I think you'll find the material by Shaya Cohen quite interesting and provocative. For this past week, we focused on two arenas: the Book of Psalms and some issues relating to the Book of Psalms. And then I brought you into this classic essay, at least from my perspective, classic essay by Tzvi Yavitz, published many years ago, but seems to me to offer a very interesting paradigm about, for Jewish history, and in general, how small nations can survive among larger nations that would like to consume it, eat it up in various ways. So first, let's talk a little bit about the Book of Psalms and issues that I raised and how you responded. Essentially, I was looking at sort of the origins of the Book of Psalms, the different approaches that Kugel and Brettler took to the Book of Psalms. I wanted you to think about Kugel's very interesting hypothesis about psalms of praise, that they are in themselves somehow a sort of korban, a sort of sacrifice, and we shouldn't simply dismiss them as words that people say. They don't have any real meaning. These words are offered to God in a service, in tefillah, in prayer. We'll talk about that in a minute. And finally, related to that, the question of how these psalms, which were written so many years ago and were written for many of them for cultic purposes or for ritual life purposes, continue to evoke such power even today as they're used in both the Jewish and the Christian tradition. So to deal with the first question, many of you did see the difference in approach from Brettler and Kugel, whereas Brettler's approach is fundamentally literary, historical. Where did they come from? The different collections and so forth, which were all quite interesting. Kugel really is interested in something different. Kugel is really interested in sort of the phenomenology of Psalms, how they were used, in what context they were used, how they worked, how they worked in relationship to sacrifices and so on. And I think that they both would help us understand that these collections came about most likely, certainly after the days of David. Perhaps there were some that go back that early. They were the 70 or 80 psalms that are attributed to David. That's a way that they got authority because they were attributed to David. It's not clear how the others got authority and got included. One of the ongoing interesting questions about the collection that we call the Tanakh is how did things get in, and why did certain things get in, and why didn't other things get in themselves? It's quite interesting, for instance, that the book of Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, the book of Job, Eov, got in. Why is it that got in, particularly since the theology of both of those books is a little bit suspect, while some books that we call the Apocrypha, in Hebrew that's called the Sfarim Chitzoniyim, the books that didn't get in, the outside books that were much more pious, didn't make it into the canon, while books that maybe were less pious did. How did Shir HaShirim get in? The book, the Song of Songs, this love poem. That's a different question, different set of questions, but very interesting, and maybe offline. I don't know that we'll be able to talk much about it here, but perhaps offline we could continue that conversation. These were different collections of a different sort that got sort of authorized over the years as collections and then became part of the literature of Israel. That's the only way that I can understand this. Kugel's understanding of Psalms of Praise, it seems to me, was really fascinating to me, that as these Psalms of Praise were uttered, were said out loud, they became offerings of people to God. And it's not simply the words that they said, and that's what happens in liturgical environments today. When one comes to a service and utters words of praise, there is a liturgical power to them. There is a theological power to them. Not for everybody, obviously, but people come and they do it, and it has a resonance to them, and it has meaning. We don't have sacrifices to offer today. We do have prayers to offer. In a sense, we are offering the prayers as we offered sacrifices. And I thought that was his concept of a speech act was quite interesting. And even in terms of the third question, which had to do with how these prayers continue to resonate today, as speech acts, as offerings, even when the words were created a long time ago, they have also achieved and attained a kind of power over the years of all these Jews saying these words. Also the fact that they're in Hebrew, which Kugel didn't really talk about, the fact that I'm saying words in Hebrew that have been said all the way back to biblical times, how far back is not so clear, makes these words have a power to them, and we make those connections to our own personal lives, even though the words themselves are perhaps fairly generic. And it is interesting that they continue to work, and in certain ways they work because they're generic. If they were too individualized, it would be much harder to use them in contemporary circumstances because they would be so located with a particular person and a particular problem. The last couple of questions that were asked had to do with the Yavitz essay, and I didn't see that many of you that actually responded to the Yavitz essay. We'll continue with it this coming week. But he offers these four models of survival. How does a small nation survive in the midst of lots of big nations? And I found it to be very useful, both in looking at ancient Jewish history, but in modern Israel history too. How do you maintain freedom and autonomy? And oftentimes what we found in the ancient period is that you had a choice of either freedom or autonomy. You could maintain your freedom but give up autonomy. You could try to generate autonomy, but then you were at the risk of losing your sustainability, your freedom. And we see that happen throughout. The other question that I asked about why Israel maintained itself in Babylonia and not in Assyria is, I think, a pretty crucial question, because if it hadn't, there wouldn't be Israel today. There wouldn't have been Jews. They would have been assimilated just like happened in Assyria. Some of you pointed out, quite rightly, that Judah itself, even before the exile, was a different kind of phenomenon, a different kind of nation. The northern kingdom of Israel was itself subject to syncretism, was itself subject to all kinds of assimilatory problems because it was so spread out. And the people had a kind of allegiance to the cultic places, but nowhere near the kind of sense of centrality that the temple in Jerusalem had for them. In the south, the temple in Jerusalem really made a kind of sense of the center and everybody connected to it in one way or the other, which meant that the problem in the south, once the temple was destroyed, was a different kind of problem than the problem was in the north. In the north, they brought other people in. The Jews wound up living with others and basically assimilated to the populations around them. Not all of them. In the south, it was quite a different kind of a situation. And when they went to Babylonia, many of them actually did stay in Judea, in that area, that probably the lower classes stayed. But in Babylonia, you were correct that they were allowed to be together. But for me, one of the most important features of this is the prophetic call to the people, not so much that they repented, as I think one person suggested, but that the destruction itself was not that our God got defeated by the more powerful gods of the Babylonians, but rather our God is the God of the Babylonians too. and our God used the Babylonians for his own purposes. And if that theology then is adopted by people, then they understand that this is all part of the divine plan, and their being exiled into Babylonia is part of God's plan, and ultimately they'll be able to return to Palestine, to Judea, which is also part of God's plan. So in my view, that kind of prophetic understanding idea gets sort of inculcated into the people. When it happens and how it happens, I don't know, but that becomes a kind of message that allows them to maintain their own understanding, their own identity, and doesn't push them into assimilation with the Babylonians whom they are around. And even when they don't go back in 539, even when they stay in Babylonia, they still have this sense of being connected to the land of Israel, the land of Judah, and perhaps the first time we can now start talking about Jews. They now see that there can be something called Israelite religion or Jewish religion, which does not depend on the land. They can live in Babylonia and still be different from the people around them and still have allegiance, not just to the land, but to the religion of Israel. So that, I think, is an important feature to this story. The question of the Jews and the great powers, maybe we'll leave that till this coming week to talk more about that, and the sense of how these four different options that Yavitz talks about gets implemented, I think, just about all of them in the history of Israel from this period of time, even before, maybe even the days of David, all the way through the destruction of the Second Temple. So have a good week. Shabbat Shalom. And hopefully we'll be in touch soon. I'm going to give you some information this coming week about the term paper that each of you will need to write. Shabbat Shalom.